So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Cardinal Donald Wuerl. Cardinal Wuerl has been the Archbishop of Washington since 2006. He serves on numerous national and international bodies, including the Pontifical Council for Culture, which is what brings us here together today. He also serves on the Vatican congregations for the doctrine of faith, bishops, and the clergy, as well as the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. He was elevated to the College of Cardinals in 2010 by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. He was appointed Relator General for the October 2012 Vatican Synod of Bishops on the new evangelization for the transmission of the Christian faith. In his role as a member of the College of Cardinals, he was a participant in the election of Pope Francis in 2013, and in December he was selected by Pope Francis to serve on the Congregation for Bishops. He's known for his teaching ministry and is the author of numerous articles and books, including the best-selling catechisms, The Teaching of Christ and the Catholic Way. His recent books include Seek First the Kingdom, New Evangelization, Passing on the Catholic Faith Today, and The Light is On for You, which was just published in February. We're honored to have the opportunity to have worked together in putting together this important conference, and it's now my privilege to introduce to you His Eminence, Cardinal Donald Wuerl.
Thank you, Dr. DeGioia. It's truly a great pleasure to greet all of you as we begin this Courtyard of the Gentiles, as it's described here, event. As we've just heard, it's the first such event this side of our side of the Atlantic. And I'm so pleased to be able to join together with the Pontifical Council for Culture, Georgetown University, and the Archdiocese of Washington in saying a word of a very, very warm welcome to everyone. To you, Dr. DeGioia, the president of Georgetown University, I need to express a special word of appreciation, not only for your kind introduction, but for the initiative in realizing this unique opportunity. I think we all appreciate that it's Georgetown University and its leadership that's making this event possible. It's so appropriate that Georgetown University provide the home, so to speak, for what will transpire in the next couple days, even though it won't be taking place on campus. It really requires a university to bring the type of venue that this whole event looks to as it unfolds. And in a moment, I will have the opportunity to introduce Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, the president of the Pontifical Council for Culture. As you heard in the introductions, I have the privilege of serving on that council, so in a way, the Cardinal is one of my many bosses. And I find that that becomes more and more true in life. You just collect bosses as you go along. But I want to, right at this moment, simply thank him for coming to the United States for the launching of this Courtyard of the Gentiles event. Cardinal Ravasi brings a wealth of experience in this very unique type of conversation that is envisioned in what is truly a unique experience, the Courtyard of the Gentiles. In preparation for this event, I spoke to a couple of my rabbi friends so that I was sure I understood what is this primary analogate that we are using in this discussion. And I was told that once you recognize that the Courtyard of the Gentiles was an extension of the temple experience, you can begin to see, as was said by President DeGioia in his opening remarks, that the discussions, the conversations, the dialogues are very different from what would take place, for example, if we're looking for ancient references, the Areopagus, or any of the fora that were modeled in the ancient world after the Roman Forum. What is unique and exciting about this particular working together of people with such varied backgrounds is that this unique forum presumes that religious faith is a contributing partner in the whole discussion. And hence we can look at the question of faith, culture, and the common good. Faith is a part of the courtyard because it stands right there connected to the temple. Hence it's all the more fitting that this conversation would take place in a project that is sponsored by Georgetown as part of the intellectual forum, and that all of the manifestations of dialogue and conversation would find that unique quality represented in all the people here in this room who reflect not just the secular culture, but the impact of religious faith on that very culture. It's my privilege to recognize that it's the Pontifical Council for Culture that is the inspiration and driving force. And as we gather now, it's a pleasure for me to introduce the president of the Pontifical Council for Culture. His Eminence Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi was ordained to the priesthood in 1966 for the Archdiocese of Milan. And very, very shortly after his ordination, he began graduate studies at the Pontifical Biblical Institute and then taught biblical exegesis. But very, very soon, he was appointed the prefect of the Ambrosian Library in Milan, became a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, and held that work, that post, until he was named by Pope Benedict the president of the Pontifical Council for Culture. Cardinal Ravasi is an author of what can only be described as a vast library output, consisting of numerous books, articles, abstracts in the area of biblical science, dialogue with science and the world of art and culture. And he is a very familiar face and voice in Italy, where his columns appear regularly in newspaper print, and where for many, many years he's been a fixed feature on the Channel 5 program, dealing with all the issues that we hope to deal with in this courtyard of the Gentiles. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, I'm so pleased to ask you to join me in welcoming, for this first United States Courtyard of the Gentiles, His Eminence Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi.
His Eminence Cardinal Ravasi will speak in Italian for freedom of expression and so that he is not misunderstood. And I'll try my best to say exactly in English what he says.
Vorrei innanzitutto ringraziare il Cardinale di Washington per questo saluto così affettuoso, il Presidente di Georgetown e tutti quanti sono qui presenti in questo momento, anche molti amici che ho riconosciuto.
I would first and foremost like to thank Cardinal of Washington and President De Gioia for their very affectionate words, as also all those present here, especially many of the friends whom I already know.
Il mio saluto iniziale però in questo momento esprime anche le parole stesse, vuole incarnare le parole stesse di Papa Francesco.
My first greetings would definitely want to first incarnate the words of Pope Francis.
Io infatti ho incontrato Papa Francesco mercoledì scorso, quindi una settimana fa, e ho potuto parlargli di questo incontro
e mi ha invitato a portare il saluto al cardinale, ma anche a tutti voi qui presenti.
I met His Holiness last Wednesday, and I had the opportunity to bring to him the news of this event here in the United States, and he has asked me to carry forward his greetings to the Cardinal, of course, and to all those who would be gathering here.
Mi ha anche invitato a guardare bene la bellezza di Washington perché egli non è mai stato negli Stati Uniti.
He has asked me to look well at the beauty of Washington because His Holiness has never been to the United States.
Io gli racconterò la bellezza soprattutto per i fiori di flowers di Washington.
I will take back to him the beauty of Washington, especially those of the flowers here.
Vorrei fare ora indicare soltanto due parole che sono state ripetute peraltro nell'interno dei due speech di apertura.
I would just like to repeat a few words that have already been included in the first two speeches of introduction here today.
Sono come le due stelle ideali che domineranno il cielo di questi giorni, di questi 3 giorni di dialogo.
These are like the two guiding stars that would illuminate the heavens during these 2 or 3 days of our meeting here.
E la prima parola è appunto la parola dialogo, che come ben sapete è una parola di origine greca.
The first word is the word dialogue, which, as you would know, originates from Greek.
Che ha due significati. Il primo significato è dialogoi, due discorsi che si incrociano tra di loro. Dia.
It has two meanings, two words with two meanings. The first word is dia, which signifies a meeting of words.
Due discorsi compiuti. Ecco perché il secondo significato. Il secondo significato è dia in greco, è in profondità, entrare in profondità nel discorso.
So if the first meaning meant meeting of two discourses, the second meaning of dia would mean going or deepening or going into profundity.
Quindi non solo incontrarci nei discorsi diversi, due discorsi, ma anche scavare in profondità, comprendere il senso profondo di ciò che sta nel cuore dei discorsi.
So it is not only a meeting in two diverse discourses, but also to, in a certain way, excavate or dig up the real meaning, the profound meaning of the discourses.
E questo dialogo avviene in un cortile, cioè in uno spazio che ha sì l'ombra del Tempio, ma è uno spazio dove passano i venti, dove non ci sono dei tetti che rinchiudono.
So this meaning comes about in an area which is in the shadow of the temple, but is also open to winds and is not covered by roofs.
Ecco, il simbolo, come sapete, è stato assunto dalla cultura ebraica. Voglio salutare la presenza del rabbino, penso, di Washington, come simbolo che abbiamo usato, e io lo dico in maniera particolare perché per molti anni ho insegnato la lingua ebraica biblica.
The meaning comes from Hebrew, and here I would like to greet the rabbi of Washington, who is here with us. And I would like to say it with very much of affection because I have taught Hebrew for quite some time.
La seconda parola, oltre a dialogo, la seconda parola è etica.
The other word that we will be using is ethics.
Etica vuol dire i valori. Già in questa giornata, attraverso i discorsi che verranno fatti tra poco, soprattutto per le culture giovanili, il mondo giovane, si cercherà di individuare, di mostrare come sia necessaria la fiamma dell'etica.
Ethic means values, the world of values, and especially these days when we are dealing with youth cultures and we'll be dealing with youth, during these days we will try to understand the meaning of these values.
E qui sicuramente ci aiuterà il professor Putnam, che è in Italia anche una persona molto nota e ammirata.
And here we will be helped by Professor Putnam, who is also very well known in Italy.
Ecco, io vorrei concludere a questo punto con per il tema dell'etica, con una testimonianza che non è una testimonianza cristiana e non è una testimonianza di un non credente. È una testimonianza che ci viene dalla lontana Asia, da un mondo religioso particolare.
I would like to conclude these few words with a witness that is not Christian, a witness that is not of non-believers, but a witness that comes from a different religious world of India.
Eppure questa persona è stimata, ascoltata dai cristiani e dagli atei.
And this person is listened to both by Christians as well as atheists.
Ecco le sue parole di Gandhi.
These are the words of Gandhi.
È un settenario, sono 7 impegni etici che speriamo anche attraverso il Cortile dei Gentili di infondere.
It is a series of 7 principles that we hope to also, in a certain sense, employ in this courtyard of the Gentiles, which principles of ethics.
Man destroys himself with politics without principle. Man destroys himself with wealth without effort and without work. Man destroys himself with intelligence without wisdom. Man destroys himself with commerce without morality. Man destroys himself with science without humanity. Man destroys himself with religion without faith. Man destroys himself with love without sacrifice and self-gift. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Cardinal Ravasi. Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, the Peter and Isabel Malkin Professor of Public Policy at Harvard, Professor Robert Putnam. I'd also like to extend our warm welcome to Mrs. Putnam, who has joined us this afternoon. The author of 14 books, the recipient of the National Humanities Medal, Professor Putnam is widely considered the leading social scientist of our time. There are 3 dimensions to Professor Putnam's work that make him the very best person to open this conference. First, for more than 2 decades, he has enabled us to understand the urgency of addressing the conditions that make civic engagement and the work of building communities possible. He's taught us the significance of social capital, to reimagine our understanding of the term, the importance of building the social fabric that binds us together as people. In his classic work, Bowling Alone, he deepens our grasp of social capital. He enables us to see what it will take for us to nurture a sense of belonging, a sense of trust in one another, a sense of connectedness. In the tradition on which this conference is built, a sense of solidarity. Second, in a more recent work, he's enabled us to see the extraordinary capacity of our religious traditions to support this work of building social capital. In American Grace, co-authored with David Campbell, they studied the place of religion in America. They found that America is a deeply religious country and a very pluralistic country. Those 2 characteristics historically are usually a recipe for deep discord. But Professors Putnam and Campbell identified a third characteristic of religion in America. We are an extraordinarily tolerant people, devout, diverse, and tolerant, characteristics that are perhaps distinctly American and invaluable resources as we seek the common good. And the third, the urgency of developing social capital and enabling the resources of our faith traditions connect to the concerns that Professor Putnam explores in his new book, which will be published in 2015, Our Kids, the American Dream in Crisis. As you hear him describe the moral urgency of this moment in his lecture today, Our Kids, Inequality, Opportunity, and a Throwaway Culture, it will be important for us to reflect on how his earlier contributions in Bowling Alone and American Grace, how these contributions provide us with guidance on how we should respond to the urgency of this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to welcome to the podium Professor Robert Putnam.
Thanks.
Eccellenze, vi sono grato della vostra presenza qui. I'm bragging a little bit because I can speak Italian. I'm honored, first of all, by the presence of so many distinguished people. I'm thrice honored because I'm deeply honored to have been introduced by Jack DeGioia, who's widely agreed, and this is a secular comment, widely agreed to be one of the greatest academic leaders in America today. Georgetown should be, and I have said that in other settings in which Jack was not present. Georgetown is incredibly lucky in its leadership. I'm honored, secondly, to be collaborating with Georgetown's initiative on Catholic social thought and public life, a program that's led by John Carr, another gracious and important spirit here. It's John Carr's leadership that has brought me together with Catholic and evangelical leaders to try to focus attention on the moral imperative of overcoming poverty and breaking through the ideological and political walls that keep us from collaborating to protect our kids. And as a Jew, I'm deeply honored, slightly bemused, I have to say, to be invited by the Catholics into the courtyard of the Gentiles. In this sacred site, though, for interfaith conversation, it's entirely appropriate that our topic should be poverty and social justice, because nothing is more universally shared across the Abrahamic faiths, and other faiths for that matter, than a deep commitment to caring for what the Lord, speaking in Matthew 25, calls the least of my brothers and sisters. That's a very widely shared commitment. As it happens, I'll engage now in a little religious education. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Judaism. In the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And Yom Kippur is famously the longest of all religious services of the year, mostly because it's the Day of Atonement and because we Jews have a lot to atone for. And on that day, we list all of them, every one. Part of the service is listing all of the evil things that we have done. I don't have time to list here all of them for you, and some of them might be more than a little bit embarrassing if I were to start listing all of the sins for which we apologize on Yom Kippur. But the very first sin that we list every year is this one. For our failures of justice, O God, we ask forgiveness. For keeping the poor in the chains of poverty, and for turning a deaf ear to the cry of the oppressed. That's the way we Jews give priority to our own obligations to care for the poor. And the most important, someplace I'm hoping there is let's see if it's this. can someone help me to figure out how I go to the next slide? No, that's not it. Let's try. How about that? There. Sorry. The most important service that Pope Francis is rendering to men and women of all faiths is to remind us of our deep moral commitment to care for our neighbors. As he said in the Rio slums, the measure of the greatness of a society is found in the way that it treats those most in need. And so what I'd like to do today is to follow up in one empirical setting, namely America today, the ways in which we Americans of all faiths and of no faith are increasingly isolating our poor kids. That's the core of my message. It's related to a debate, indeed it's part and parcel of a debate that's been going on in this country for the last couple of years about inequality. But there are different kinds of inequality to worry about. First of all, there's inequality of income or of wealth among a given generation. That's the inequality between rich folks and poor folks in America today, all of us of the same generation. And equality of income or equality of wealth has never been actually the highest priority of the American political culture. We care about it, but we care about lots of other things besides just equality. But there's a second kind of equality, which is equality of opportunity. That's assuming that this is about intergenerational change, and equality of opportunity refers to the degree to which any given person's accomplishments in life or opportunities in life are controlled by who their parents were. And that kind of equality, equality of opportunity, the equality that's embodied in the notion that all of us ought to have a fair start in life. It ought not to matter who our parents were in terms of our opportunity for a rich, fulfilling life. That objective, sometimes referred to in terms of the American dream, has been very widely shared in American political culture and has not been a matter of partisan conflict at all. Basically, all parts of the American political spectrum have agreed that we ought to worry about equality of opportunity. And historically, we've done better than most other countries in that. We've not always been the most equal in the outcomes, but we've usually been ranked up at or near the top in terms of whether our kids all got a fair shot, regardless of who their parents were. But what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years in America is that America has become more divided along class lines. There's been a polarization of American society along social class and economic lines. And that shows up in many different ways. It does show up, of course, in the widely discussed widening of income distribution so that we've got increasingly some very, very rich people and then lots of really poor people. That's the part of this story that you've certainly heard before. You may also know that it's not just in terms of income, but also in terms of many kinds of social networks. We've become more divided by class. We live in a more class-segregated society. In religious terms, we live in a more integrated society than we did a generation or two ago. We're more likely to live near someone of a different religion than we used to be. We're more likely to marry someone of a different religious background than we used to. We're more likely to go to school with people from a different religious background. And same is true in racial terms, not quite so strongly, but it's still in racial terms it's true. We're more likely than our parents or grandparents were to live near someone of a different race, to marry someone of a different race, to go to school with someone of a different race. So America is becoming, certainly in religious and to some extent in racial terms, a more integrated society. It's more integrated than it was when I was growing up. But in class terms, we're significantly less integrated than we were a generation or two ago. We're less likely to live near someone who has a different level of education or a different income from us. We're more likely to live in a neighborhood where most of the people have our level of income and education. We're more likely to marry people who have our educational and income levels, who come from a similar background. They may very well not be the same religion as our origins. They may not even be the same race, but they're very likely to come from the same class background as we do. And we're more likely to go to school with people who have the same class and economic background as we do. So we're becoming more polarized in class terms, and what goes along with that, as I will say in a minute, is that the working class part of the American population is more and more isolated from the rest of American society in residential and in religious and in economic and in interpersonal terms. Now, I want to show, there are different kinds of social scientists. I'm a social scientist. Professionally, there are different kinds of social scientists. Broadly speaking, social scientists can be divided into the counters and the poets. And I'm a counter, generally not a poet. But I want to begin with just a personal story. So, and I ask your pardon at the outset for imposing upon you a story of a community. It happens to be my hometown. And you'll just have to bear with me as I tell you the story of my hometown, because I will at the end try to argue this place is quite typical of America as a whole. But let's not go there yet. I grew up in a really nice little town of 5,000 people called Port Clinton, Ohio. It's on Lake Erie. I was growing up in the 50s. I don't want to say that Port Clinton was nirvana, because there was still racism and sexism and so on, no doubt. But in class terms, in economic terms, it was remarkably equal. There were no very poor people in town. There were only a few kids who would qualify as rich, and they tried very hard to hide that fact from the rest of us. I now know, by the way, I should say, everything I'm going to say now could pass the scientific test. I am telling you about my hometown, but I'm not just remembering it through the golden haze of 50 years. We've gone back and we've checked everything I'm saying scientifically. Port Clinton was one of the most equal places in America in terms of the distribution of income. It was not a very rich place. It was, the town was, the dads of most of the moms of my classmates were stay-at-home moms, and the dads were, some of them were factory employees on the assembly line. They worked in local auto parts factories, or they were small farmers, or had orchards, or they were fishermen. Because we're on Lake Erie, there was an active fishing industry, or they were small businessmen. My dad was a small businessman. And it was not a particularly well-educated place. Indeed, of my classmates' parents, about 40% of my classmates' parents had not graduated from high school. So a big chunk of us were coming from homes that were pretty uneducated. But the town had a lot of social capital. That is to say, there was a dense network of connections among people. Some of it was religious and some of it was not religious. People cared about one another a lot in this town. Indeed, the book Bowling Alone, it was only after I wrote it that I realized to some extent I was kind of reflecting on my own childhood and what I had missed there. What I miss now from that childhood. So I was an extremely lucky guy. And my class, growing up, we now know, because we've interviewed all of them who still survive, had lived the American dream. 80% of the kids in my class, 80% got more education than their parents did. About 3/4 of them had a lot more lifetime income, did much better. All of us really we were pretty lucky. We all did pretty well. And not because we were smarter than anybody else. We just were living in a time in which it was possible for people to have the American dream right there. I was lucky enough to go off to college with the fellowship from one of the local employers. I went to Swarthmore then went off to, at Swarthmore met this lovely woman who's sitting here, and we've been married for 51 years, and we had 2 terrific kids. I went off to Oxford and then to Yale and ended up at Harvard. And we had 2 kids, and they both went to Harvard, and they're both extremely well educated, and they married people who were well educated, and we have 7 terrific grandchildren. I want to show you the pictures of the 7. And the 2 oldest of the grandchildren are now off at college. One's at Haverford College, one's at Harvard, and one will be entering Swarthmore as it happens next fall. I want to just tell you a little bit about, and our oldest grandchild is named Miriam, and she's the one who's now at Haverford. She's a terrific kid. She worked really hard, and she's had wonderful opportunities because of the hard work she's done. And last summer she went off, and my granddaughter was in, of course, Italy, studying cheese making. Came back as an expert, and she's off next summer working with immigrants in Paris. So she's a pretty cosmopolitan person and very admirable. Meanwhile, there was a guy named, I'm going to call him Joe. Joe didn't literally play on the same football team with me because he was a couple of years behind me, but he could have. I played tight end incompetently, and he played tackle. So we were, both on the same football team. I went off to college. He didn't go off to college. He got a job got a blue-collar job locally, but that's fine. And he had every reason to hope that he would do well in life because all the other blue-collar people in town had done well. And in fact, he had a pretty successful job. And then, just like me, he and his wife had some kids. But there the story begins to separate because Joe's kid, my kids, remember, went off to Harvard and then met other people who were well educated and had these great grandchildren. His kids never have held a job, a steady job. His kids have never been married. That has not stopped them from procreating. So Joe has some grandchildren, including one that I will call Mary Sue. Mary Sue happens to be exactly the same age as my Miriam. But Mary Sue has had a very different life than Miriam. I would just want to read to you our field notes on a conversation that we had last year with Mary Sue. Mary Sue tells a harrowing tale of loneliness, distrust, and isolation. Remember what the Pope said about isolated, lonely kids. That's Mary Sue. He's talking about Mary Sue. Her parents split up when she was 5, and her mother turned to stripping and left her alone and hungry for days. Her dad hooked up with another woman, who hit Mary Sue, refused to feed her, and confined Mary Sue to her room with baby gates. Until she went to school, Mary Sue's only friend was a yellow mouse who lived in the apartment. Caught trafficking marijuana at 16, Mary Sue spent several months in a juvenile detention center, failed out of high school, and later on got a kind of a diploma online. Her experiences have left her with a deep-seated mistrust of anyone and everyone, embodied in the scars on her arms that we saw, where a boyfriend had burned her in the middle of the night. Mary Sue wistfully recalls her stillborn baby, born when Mary Sue was 13. Since breaking up with the baby's dad, who left her for someone else, and with a second fiancé, who cheated on her after his release from prison, Mary Sue is currently dating an older man with 2 infants, born 2 months apart, to 2 other mothers. And to Mary Sue, this feels like the best she can hope for. Mary Sue is the same age as our granddaughter, Miriam. But the futures they have are just in different universes. Mary Sue is a real person. Mary Sue's this older man, has told her that he has an opportunity for her. He's going to get her a job as a model working in Toledo or Detroit. It's almost impossible for me to stand here and talk to you about the different futures that face Miriam and Mary Sue. And Mary Sue did nothing to deserve this. She did nothing to deserve this. She made one mistake in her life, and Miriam made one really good decision. Miriam's really good decision early in her life was in her choice of parents and grandparents. Miriam chose great parents and even better grandparents. And she's had a lot of things have flowed from that have been really good for her. Mary Sue made only one choice. She chose the wrong parents. And once upon a time, that choice would not have had the inevitable consequences that they do have now, almost inevitable consequences they do have for kids in the lower parts, growing up in the lower parts of our society. There's something else I didn't tell you about Port Clinton. Port Clinton, I did tell you that it was a pretty equal place 2 generations ago. I haven't told you that Port Clinton has changed. Part of what's happened, I forgot to tell you this, but it's maybe you probably guessed it. Part of what happened to Mary Sue's parents is that when they came out of Port Clinton High School, they thought they were going to get good jobs, but when they came out, those good jobs were all gone. The local factories are all closed. If you go to Port Clinton now on the east side of town, you can see the old Standard Products building. It looks like a ruined cathedral. It's surrounded by barbed wire and EPA signs on it saying, toxic waste site. And for a while in Port Clinton, after all those factories closed, the strong social bonds in the town persisted, and kids were protected in a way from the fact that the economy had fallen apart. But all of those economic hammer blows eventually disrupted the social fabric in town. And about a decade after the last of the factories closed, the juvenile delinquency rate in Port Clinton, which had been very low in national terms, went up tenfold and is now among the highest in the state and relatively high compared to any place in America. The out-of-wedlock birth rate, which had been quite low, this is a small town, right? So it's a small and pretty conservative town. The out-of-wedlock birth rate had been, in 1980, 7%. By 1990, had become more than 50%. And that's the result of all those economic hammer blows. It's not, the story about Port Clinton is not entirely a cloudy story, however, because Port Clinton has a beautiful site on Lake Erie. When I was growing up, the shores of Lake Erie were fishing camps and orchards and farms and so on. But now, all along that shoreline of Lake Erie is, in effect, a gated community, which is 100 yards deep and 20 miles long. And in that gated community are lovely homes, really, really beautiful homes, mostly $1 million and up, and golf courses and lagoons with yachts and so on. It's a beautiful place, honestly. It's a beautiful place. If you come 100 yards inland, you come to people who are living in double wides, which is where Mary Sue's parents lived, at least for part of their lives. The poverty rate, the child poverty rate in the strip along the shore, there's one census tract along the shore, and the child poverty rate there is 0. And 100 yards inland, the child poverty rate is 50%. And if you go to Port Clinton High School now, most kids now drive to Port Clinton High School. I didn't, my years, people walked or took the bus or something, but now most kids drive. But you will see parked in the parking lot at the high school, right next door to each other, a BMW convertible bought by by the parents of some kid who lives out on the shoreline, and a junk wreck kind of car, barely able to move, which is where another one of the classmates lives in the junk car. I don't mean just there. He drives away at night. They won't let him park there overnight, but he drives off into someplace out in the countryside and then comes back to school next morning. This is unbelievable. This is a little town. I'm not talking about the social differences in a big place like Washington or New York or LA or Atlanta or whatever. It's a little town. Notice that almost all the characters in this story are white. So this is not about race. And in fact, almost nothing that I'm going to be talking about today is actually about race. It's about social class. There are important racial differences in America, and racial injustices, and I don't want anybody to walk out thinking I'm saying that we've solved race. I'm not at all saying that, but I am saying that what we haven't noticed is this enormous increase in social class differences within various racial communities. If we had more time, I'd tell you about some of the class gaps among black people, or among Latino people, or among white people in America. These class differences are growing rapidly and savagely. And there are many causes for it, but there's one more thing I have to say about Port Clinton before I start showing you some pictures and trying to express the counter that's in me rather than the poet that's in me or the preacher that's in me. What I want to say is about what's happened in Port Clinton. The most important thing that's happened in Port Clinton is this. When I was growing up, my parents and their peers all talked about all the kids in town as our kids. They're all our kids here in town. And when they said we've got to vote for a bond issue so that we can build a new swimming pool or add a French class or whatever for our kids, they did not mean my sister and me. Indeed, they were doing that long after my sister and I had left. They meant all the kids in town were our kids. But what's happened in America over the last 30 or 40 years is that our conception of our kids, indeed our conception of we, has shriveled. So now if you talk about our kids, you mean your biological kids. So if you ask me, is EJ is here. If EJ said, how are your kids? He doesn't, in fact, intend me to answer in terms of how all the kids in Cambridge are doing. He means, how are Jonathan and Laura doing? And that transformation, that radical narrowing of who we think of as our kids is the most important underlying factor here. I'm going to come back to the Pope in just a minute because he and I turn out to agree on this. He has it on higher authority than I do, but I can show you the data. No, the poor kids in my class, let me tell you, there were 2 black kids in my class. There was racism in Port Clinton when I was growing up. I'm not saying there wasn't, but there were 2 black kids in my class. Both of them came from homes in which nobody had gone beyond 3rd grade. Indeed, for a long time while they were in school, they didn't have indoor plumbing. So these are really, really poor people. But despite racism, people sort of thought of them as our kids because they were part of town. They were, they're Port Clinton kids are our kids. Both of those kids, because they are both extremely talented and very hardworking, both of those kids coming from homes where the maximum of education was 3rd grade, have master's degrees. Think about the upward mobility embodied in their lives. And that's partly because they worked really hard and because they are exceptionally talented kids. But it's also because people in Port Clinton thought of them as, like everybody else, as one of our kids. Today, most people in Port Clinton don't even know that Mary Sue exists. Indeed, after I published an op-ed in the New York Times last summer about Port Clinton, I got enormous flack from people in Port Clinton telling me that I was making it up, that Mary Sue didn't exist. It's frightening that they don't know that Mary Sue is there. And they didn't believe when I said to them, if you drive down Main Street or down Route 2, Route 153, the poverty rate on your right is 0 and the poverty rate on your left is 50%. They only look toward the lake, so they only know about those kids. Those are our kids, but not Mary Sue. Okay, so that's I recognize, a kind of a sermon. Actually, it's emotional for me, as you probably can tell, even to talk about the comparison, particularly the comparison between Mary Sue and Miriam. But I now, want to try to show you quickly that this is not just a matter of my little town. It's true all over America. We've interviewed hundreds of rich kids and poor kids in America over the last couple of years. And I could tell you exactly the same story in Atlanta or in Orange County, California, or in Austin, Texas, or in Boston, or in Duluth, or in Bend, Oregon, or in Philadelphia. This is not a Rust Belt story. It's not a small town story. It's an American story. And what I want to show you now is a series of graphs. Forgive me, because we're switching now to the counting part. A series of charts and graphs. I'm going to tell you what they're going to look like, and then I'm going to go through them sort of quickly, but you'll see right away what I'm showing you. They're what we call scissors graphs. The horizontal axis will be years. Here we're going to see 1970 and 1980 and 1990 and so on. The vertical axis is going to be some measure of how kids are doing. And the upper part of the upper blade of the scissors is going to be kids coming from college-educated homes. And the lower blade is going to be kids coming from high school-educated homes. I'm talking about those class differences, and for simplicity's sake, I'm going to be using, basically American society, American parents and population, can be divided, roughly speaking, into thirds. The upper third of American society are college graduates. The lower third of American society are people who have not gone beyond high school. The middle third are people who got a high school degree and then a little bit of something else. They went to trade school, or they started college, or they went to community college, or whatever. I'm going to be comparing the upper third, the college-educated kids coming from the college-educated homes, to the lower third, kids coming from parents who did not get beyond high school. And what we're going to see is not just that, and I'm going to call them rich kids and poor kids just because I can't use the more elaborate language here, but when I say rich kids, don't think Bill Gates. Think you. Because by my measure, almost everyone in this room is rich. I mean by rich merely you have a college degree. And when I say poor, don't think I'm talking about the poorest of the poor. Think I'm talking about anybody whose parents didn't get beyond high school. So let me show you some examples of what I mean here. First of all, how much time and money do parents invest in their kids? Start over here. This graph shows what we call good night moon time. Most of you will know, if you've had kids, Good Night Moon is a book that you read to your kids. How many have ever heard of the book Good Night Moon? Yeah, okay. All time that parents spend with kids can be divided into two things: diaper time and good night moon time. That is physical care and development. And basically there's not much difference in diaper time either between classes or over time. We're spending the same amount of time changing the diapers and providing physical care. But there's been a dramatic change in good night moon time, and namely what you can see is both among rich kids and among poor kids, there's been an increase in the time that parents spend in development, in child development, caring for their children in a more active way, like reading to them. And that's good news. You see the scissors are there, although here the scissors are pointing upwards, so that things are getting a little better for poor kids as well as rich kids, but getting better, a lot faster for the kids from the top than for the bottom. And so by now, in 2013, it widens a little bit further. You can summarize that by saying the class gap in good night moon time, the difference between the upper third and the lower third, is about an hour a day. The average kid coming from college-age backgrounds is getting about an hour a day more good night moon time. Now you should not, that is the most damning thing I will say all day. The reason is that we know now from brain science, I don't do brain science, but I have paid attention to the recent developments in brain science. Brain development is powerfully affected by verbal interaction between parents and children. And the amazing advances in brain science means we can actually see this in brain scans. Brain development is fundamentally a social phenomenon. The developing brain develops in a kind of a ping pong match in which the child sends out a message, serves, and a parent responds. If the parent responds and the child sends out, ping, pong, every pong, more brain cells, more connections. But if a child sends out a ping and there's no pong, there's no brain cells. I'm simplifying a lot, but I'm not making this up. So what you need to think of is an hour a day more brain development, more pinging and ponging. And that's huge, because that is a strong predictor of measured IQ at age 5 or 6. So at age 5 or 6, it's going to look like the poor kids are dumber. And therefore, someone's going to say, well, what do you know? You can't do much with poor kids. They're just dumb, or their parents were dumb. And that's simply false. It isn't that they have bad genes. It's that there was no one there to pong with them. So that's why I look at that graph and know about the brain science, and now you do, and you should look at that graph and say, oh my God, Mary Sue, when she was 3 or 4 or 5 and in that room with only the mouse was not ponging. And therefore, every day, my Miriam was getting an hour more brain development than Miriam was. That's investments in time. You can see the same thing over here in terms of, can I go backwards? Yeah. This is the same thing, but measured in terms of money, how much money we spend on our kids. And it's not surprising that rich people spend more money on their kids than poor people do. And I don't mean spend more money. This is not money. This graph is not, money on fancy designer clothes. It's development enrichment expenses. You look at that graph and you should say they're spending on violin lessons and trips to the zoo and computer games and better daycare and so on. And what you see there, it's not so surprising that rich people spend more money on their kids than poor people. I spend more money on, Rosemary and I love giving gifts to our grandchildren. And I'm not saying that's evil. But what you do see there is that gap in absolute in constant dollars has been growing wider and wider and wider. So just at the same time that Miriam was going off to study cheese making in Italy, it cost some money. She got that experience, and Mary Sue was never going to get that experience. You understand why I'm using Miriam here as my example, right? I'm doing that because I want to make clear I'm not trying to say it was evil for us to help her get the experience studying in Italy. I'm saying that it was evil that there's nothing like that Mary Sue got. And moreover, the gap is growing, bigger and bigger and bigger. We can also see the same thing in measurements of parental involvement in schools. We know actually that it's better for kids if their parents are actively involved in their educational system. Over here we see volunteering at school, and you might say, I would say indeed, it's great that our children were volunteering in their kids' schools. And that they were helping everybody, and that's wonderful. But of course they were also learning which teacher not to get next year. Right? And you know what I mean? And how to try and did you really have to pass that extra exam? And what's the right junior high they should be aiming at? And all that kind of stuff. That's what's happening with that on the upper arm. And on the lower arm, it's poor kids not having parents who don't have a whole lot of savvy. I don't mean the parents are dumb. They just don't have a whole lot of savvy about how you get through kids through school. Over here we have, and you probably think I'm really using some silly examples. I hope you don't think that, actually. Here we have family dinners. How many times a week do you have a family dinner? Actually, family dinners have sort of gone out of style. Do you actually remember what a family dinner was? Okay, it was having dinner with mom, dad, or at least the parents and the children. And you could see that took a big hit from the middle 80s down to the 90s, or from the beginning of the 80s down to the 90s, and that's basically when moms were going off to work. It's great. I'm not opposed to mom going off to work, but it's just hard when you got two parents, or it's just hard to all figure out how you're also going to sit down for dinner. But then in 1990, the middle class families suddenly realized, That's what we should be. We should be spending time with the family and asking the kids, how you doing? And how'd your day go at school? And they were right. That is important. That's actually provably relevant to child development. But on the other hand, over here, the decline in family dinners continued. And that's not just because whether it's a single parent or not single parent family. In general, poorer families, for various reasons, didn't continue to have family dinners. We've interviewed lots of people all over the country. One of them is a woman, a very remarkable woman, who's a hardworking, tough-talking, no-nonsense, tough-loving, single black mom in Atlanta, and she cares deeply for her kids. But when we ask her about, how often do you sit down to have dinner together with your kids, she said, oh, no, we don't do that lovey-dovey stuff. We don't have any time for how was your day. And, at one point, in a human sense, you understand that. You can kind of empathize with her. She's worried about a lot bigger things than that. She's worried about having enough money that maybe she can afford a house a little bit further away from the crime of the ghetto. So what she's doing is not evil, but she's also not able to do what is happening in the middle-class homes when they have dinner together with their kids. The same thing is true in extracurricular activities, band, chorus, art, dance. Up among kids coming from the upper half or the upper part of the society, down among kids coming from the lower part. Even sports, up among upper middle class or middle class kids, down among working class kids. Even sports. Now, keep in mind, I'm not just calling your attention to the fact there's a gap. There's always been probably something of a gap between rich kids and poor kids. I'm talking about that gap growing rapidly in recent decades. And it's getting worse all the time. Let's see. Church attendance. I'm hoping this will get the attention of at least a few people in the room. Church attendance among American young people is down. Whoa, sorry. Why is that? There. Church attendance is down. All these numbers are going down. That would not, if that comes as a surprise to anybody, if that comes as a surprise to any religious people in the room, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Of course, you know the attendance at Mass or at services is down. But what you may not have realized is it's especially down among working class kids and not so much down among middle class kids. And that's important. It's probably important for the souls of the kids. I'm not professionally competent to say whether that's true. But it's sure bad for them in terms of their social development, because when they were involved, and I'm not just talking about their moral education, I'm just talking about the social capital at church, the friends that they have, the people who are looking out for them. And there was nobody looking out for Mary Sue. Her parents might have gone to church, but they didn't take her, and then they stopped going to church too. By the way, that is a much more general phenomenon. It's not just kids. It's true in general in America. And this is true within various particular denominations and communities. It's true even among the black church. People in America are generally much more religiously observant, but even among the black community, attendance is not down among the black middle and upper class, but it is down a lot among the black working class. So these are really quite broad-scale trends. One way to think about this, and I don't want to appeal to your self-interest because this is not a self-interested crowd, but if those kids were in church, if that line were up even closer to there, I can tell you just where they'd be. They'd either be in a Catholic church or they'd be in a Baptist church or some other evangelical church. They would not, those are not people who would be going to Methodist or mainline Protestant, or wouldn't be heading to temple with me. So to the Catholics and evangelicals in the room, I'm hoping that there are plenty of Catholics and evangelicals in the room, these are your kids. I mean, they're my kids too, that's what I'm trying to say, but they are actually your kids that are not in church. And there's similar gaps. Now it's getting boring, isn't it? You just see the same gap over and over again. There's a gap in youth volunteering. Youth volunteering went up for everybody, all kids in the 90s. That's mainly because it was volunteering of a certain sort. That is, they were required to volunteer in order to graduate from high school. Everybody couldn't get a degree couldn't get a high school degree in Maryland, as you probably know, unless you volunteered. So that had an effect on volunteering. But then once that effect was over, the middle class kids kept on volunteering and the working class kids stopped, and that meant the middle class kids were getting more soft skills. Don't think that all this stuff about, okay, they're not taking, the middle class kids are getting a chance to be in band and chorus and football and dance and all that, and that's, well, who cares whether that's true? Actually, somebody's written that about my work. Who cares whether there's a difference in extracurricular activities? The idea, and the answer to that is, the market cares a lot about that, because what you learn in those extracurricular activities is the most important set of soft skills. You'll learn how to collaborate. You learn how to, in the short run, push somebody else's, you learn to block for somebody else so that they can run for the touchdown. That's a valuable skill. You learn how to, care for other people. That's a valuable skill. All of that was what Miriam has in spades. She's a really, really good organizer. And what Mary Sue doesn't have at all. And the same thing is true for the volunteering. Actually, some of the volunteering, I don't want to be dismissive of youth volunteering, but a lot of this growth in volunteering is because kids want to get into Harvard or Georgetown, and they figure the way to get your attention or mine is to volunteer. And I'm not opposed to it, but it's true for measures of social connectedness. That is, do you have a friend? If something went wrong, do you have somebody you could talk to about it? Middle class kids are soaring on that, and working class kids aren't. And social trust. Social trust is down among all American young people. Footnote, read this great book called Bowling Alone, which talked about why social trust was down. But it's down much more among these working class. That's where the decline in social trust in America is concentrated, working class kids. Now, why is that? Is that some national, hitherto unknown epidemic of adolescent paranoia? No. It's perfectly sensible for Mary Sue not to trust anybody. Nobody in her life has been trustworthy. She's been left isolated by her family and her parents and her school and her churches and the other community organizations in town. Nobody in Port Clinton has cared about her. So for her not to trust anybody is completely rational. If she trusted other people, I'd wonder about her. Actually, she's told us, she trusts two people in the world. She trusts Joe, her grandfather, that's good news, and she trusts my research team because we've expressed interest in her. That is nuts. Or another way to put it is, think how desolate you would have to be if the only person in the world you trusted besides your own grandfather was some crazy academic half a country away. That's a mark of how devoid her life is, how isolated her life is. And this graph says it's not just Mary Sue, and it's not just Port Clinton, it's true nationwide. It's true for high-quality daycare, it's true for completing college. It's getting boring, I know, so I'll keep going here. But what I'm trying to say is, this is not just Mary Sue, it's not just Port Clinton, it's not just test scores. It is true for test scores, by the way. Test scores show the same thing. Test scores for kids coming from well-off backgrounds are rising. Test scores for kids coming from less well-off backgrounds aren't. It's even true for things like obesity. You know the youth obesity epidemic that people have been talking about? Well, it's true there has been a youth obesity epidemic, but it was over a decade ago among kids coming from college-educated homes, and it's still in full swing. It's still in full swing among the Mary Sues of the world, and also secondhand smoke. Working class kids are more and more exposed to secondhand smoke because their parents tend to smoke. Middle class kids are less and less exposed because middle class parents have stopped smoking. Working class parents are increasing their smoking. Can you play all this through? The Mary Sues of the world hardly have a chance. Now, if we talk to these kids, and sometimes we're just floored by how resilient they are. And you want to cherish that resilience. And you want to say, isn't it wonderful how resilient kids can be? And I do that often when we're reading these talking to these kids or reading these accounts of their lives. But you can't allow yourself to be too distracted by that resilience. The fact of the matter is, these poorer kids, at every step in their life, they've got shackles on their feet. And it's not that I want to shackle Miriam, for goodness sakes, but Mary Sue doesn't have a chance with the shackles that she's had on her since she was born. Okay, well, I will be a little quicker here, although I'm getting into the more controversial parts of this. This is a purple problem. You know what I mean by a purple problem? Parts of this problem you can understand most clearly with red conservative lenses. And parts of the problem you can understand most clearly seen through blue progressive lenses. But if you look through only blue or only red lenses, you'll miss an important part of the problem. That's what I mean by purple. Chiedo scusa perché negli Stati Uniti la coloratura politica è l'inverso, no? Stupidaggine, ma... So let's go through what we know about the causes here. Part of it is the collapse of the working class family. This is the part that is probably most visible if you stand on the center right of the political spectrum. You're aware of the collapse of the working class family. That was embodied in Mary Sue's story. Here you can see it. These are trends in births to unmarried mothers. Births to unmarried mothers is essentially flat among college-educated women. Births to high school-educated women are rapidly rising, so that now more than 50% of all births to high school-educated or less moms in America are out of wedlock. What makes it even worse is that the divorce rate, the divorce epidemic is over in the middle class and upper middle class in America. Divorce rate has fallen a lot among college-educated Americans, but among high school-educated Americans, it's still in full force, and indeed, by some measures, divorce is expanding. So even if the child has a birth father in the home at the beginning of this process, he's very likely not to be there for very long. And so when you look at the whole lifespan of kids until they reach 17, this is basically a family values graph, right? This is, oh, damn. Excuse me. All right. Chiedo scusa. This is the fraction of American kids coming from high school educated homes who are living in a single parent family. And this is the same fraction over time. This starts in 1955 and goes up to 2012. This is that same fraction in the middle class, among college-educated people. You can see it rises here. That's when divorce was expanding among college-educated Americans, but then it declines because divorce becomes less common among upper-middle-class Americans. Charles Murray, that some of you will know, has talked about this graph. It's an important factually important fact. Where the fragility of the working class family comes from is an important issue and a controversial issue. People on the right think that the collapse of the working class family comes from a collapse of values and morals. And as a left person on the left, I think part of that is true. It's not the morals of the mothers that I'm concerned about. It's the morals of the fathers. Many working class guys now are not fit for marriage, but that hasn't stopped them from procreating, and it hasn't stopped them from walking away from the results of that procreation. And I do think that's a moral issue. I don't want to pin all the blame on them. One of the reasons that that's happening is because that is exactly the part of American society that has been the worst hit by the economic changes. That male working class has had no raise in a long time. Indeed, the average working class person in America, in Port Clinton, I was struck when I heard this fact, is now making less in constant dollars than their grandparents did when I was growing up. The average wage for working class Americans in Port Clinton is lower than it was in the 1960s. Lower. So that's the group. So Joe's kids, who had kids but didn't get married and didn't worry about their kids, there's a lot to be said negatively about them, but on the other hand, they bore the brunt of the economic crisis of the last 30 years in America. So that's part of the story. Part of it is the economic insecurity among poor families. Let me interrupt myself for just a moment. You probably know, you did hear President DeGioia say that I am a faculty member at Harvard. You probably realize it's not easy to become a professor at Harvard. There are a lot of tests you have to pass in order to become a professor at Harvard. One of the hardest tests you have to pass is a test in name dropping. And I am now about to convince you that I'm a legitimate Harvard professor. So a couple of years ago, I was at the White House talking with the then President, George Bush, and the whole senior Bush White House, and Laura Bush and so on. That was the name drop. Did you get that? I told the President and his wife and the whole crew there about the results, and I'm confessing now my prejudice and ignorance as a progressive academic. The president was much more worried about the problem than I thought he would be. I mean, he was actually seriously worried. He kept calling it Putnam's Gap. What's happened to Putnam's Gap? What explains Putnam's Gap? I didn't like to have to be the owner of the gap, but nevertheless, he was very concerned about it. He kept me for 45 minutes, which is a long time if you're president. And he said, how much of this is family structure? And that was the right first question. A lot of it is family structure. And then he said, well, what else is going on? I said, that's probably 35% of the problem, and which is a big deal, but it's not everything. And he said, well, what else is going on? And I sort of was trying to articulate the fact that the growing income gap in America was having its effects on the kids. But I was not being very articulate. And Laura Bush, his wife, interrupted me, thank goodness, and turned to her husband and said, George, just think about it. If you don't know how long you're going to keep your job, and you don't know how long you're going to keep your house, you just have less energy to invest in the kids. Bingo. In my group, we call that the Laura Bush hypothesis. And there's a lot of evidence she's right. That is a big part of the problem. So there's an economic root to this. By the way, those of you, I assume everybody in the room knows John Carr, but if you don't know John Carr, he's sitting right there. Raise your hand, John, so they do know you. And he's created this wonderful new organization centered at Georgetown called AND, A-N-D. And it's meant to be, it's called AND because he doesn't want to have a fight about whether is this family or is it economics. He wants to say it's family and economics. And I've tried now just to show you that even the first family of the former first family, the current first family, by the way, also gets this. I would not going to drop that name, but I've spent a lot of time talking with them about the same problem. Oh, I did drop the name. So that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that there's a kind of arms race underway in terms of parenting and parental savvy, so that even working class parents are trying to do better helping their kids along, but they're never going to be able to catch us. That is the people in this room. We know how important it is to raise our kids, and we know how important it is to provide all the enrichment and to do the good night moon time. And you can see in the data this kind of arms race in which every little bit that the working class makes, they just fall further behind. A good example of that, by the way, is high school dropouts. We've had a big focus on high school dropouts in America. That's great. It's actually closed the gap. High school graduation is one of the things that doesn't look like this. The gap has been closed, but it's been closed exactly when the high school degree has less and less value economically. So they've been allowed to win a race that no longer matters. Meanwhile, we have been, that is when I say we, I mean college-educated Americans, have been concentrating on what matters for the 21st century, which is college completion, and the scissors for college completion, actually having a college degree, is getting bigger. And that's an arms race. I'm not proposing that we should have us stop worrying about Miriam, but I am saying that's a part of the problem. And finally, another Another part of the problem is the social safety net that's been frayed. If you go into working class neighborhoods, we've been doing a lot of work in a white working class neighborhood in Philadelphia. It's partly Polish American, was and is Polish American and Irish American. It's almost all white, heavily Catholic, but there are some evangelical churches in the neighborhood. And it's been that way for a long time. And it used to be a really thriving neighborhood right on the river. And in that earlier period, if a kid got into trouble or their family life was a little difficult, there was a sociological safety net there to catch the children. Sociological safety net is just my jargon for saying there were the churches, and there were people in the churches who were looking out for the kids. There were the Italian American Society or the Sons of Iberia, and they had a youth sports group, and they would be paying attention to the kids. Or there was the guy who was, in the public park there, who was responsible for putting the hoop on the basket or for painting the white lines on the football field. His job was to do that maintenance, but actually he was also keeping track of what kids were getting there and doing okay, and what kids were getting lost. And then there were a lot of not unmarried, but stay-at-home moms. And they were also keeping an eye on everybody else's kids, because they were all our kids. Rosemary says that in that era, there was no such thing as an unauthorized mom. Everybody was authorized to be everybody's mom, and therefore if a kid got in trouble, somebody else would notice. Now, if you go to the same neighborhood, all of that is gone. All of it is gone. The church's presence is much diminished. All churches. I mean, it's true for the Catholic Church there, but it's true in general for churches in this neighborhood. Their presence is much diminished. The Parks and Rec budget was the first thing that was cut when the Philly had financial problems. The moms now are out doing other great things. That's fine, but they're not around to help the Sons of Iberia or the Sons of Poland or whatever. Those fraternal organizations are all vanishing quickly. Read the book, this marvelous book called Bowling Alone, which describes the collapse of those organizations. It used to be if a chick fell out of a nest, there would be something there to catch the chick. But in this neighborhood, I'm talking about a very real place in Philadelphia, if the chick falls out of the nest now there's nothing to catch it except gangs. That's what catches these kids. And that's where the gangs come from. Well, I've talked too long, and I'm conscious of that, and I ask forgiveness of the president. And if we had more time, I'd talk more about what can be done, and if you're interested, I can talk more about it now. But as I said, the real underlying cause of this, and the thing that we have to fix if we're going to fix the problem, we have to fix this shriveled sense of whose kids are our kids. If we fix that, if all of you in this room thought of Mary Sue as your child, we could hardly walk out of here without wanting to go to Port Clinton and save her and hug her and help her. If that was our child, we would want to help her. And the reason that I think this is fundamental, this is a secular problem, and there's lots of sociology to do with it and so on, but it is also fundamentally a moral problem. Actually, so you just don't think this is just me talking at you. You can read that while I talk. I'm in the way? I don't want to get in the way of that. That's exactly the point I'm making. And if as you know, I'm a secular Jew, and mostly I get paid to be an academic. You probably can tell I care a lot about this problem, because I think this is by far the most important problem facing our country over the first half of the 21st century. I mean, domestic problem, who knows what will happen internationally. And I'm not talking about global warming, but in terms of American domestic policy, this is the most important problem, because we are on the verge, if we don't do something, of becoming a caste society. That's what all those graphs mean. And a society in which the only thing that matters is to how well you do in life is your choice of parents. That can't be a society we want to live in. I'm confident we can figure out how to fix this if and only if we change that. If and only if we begin thinking about these kids as our kids. And if we do, the only way that can happen is if America's major religious faith traditions take this problem seriously. I don't mean just one among 20 problems. And that's what I think you should excuse the expression Pope Francis is the gift from God. I mean, I know you think that's really, really, really true. I mean it too, in the sense that what he's doing is to say, there are a lot of problems that are worth worrying about, but this is the problem. And if Americans actually acted that way, we could figure out ways to fix it. And as I say, we can talk about policy options if you want to, but if and only if large numbers of Americans feel that way, are we going to fix this problem? You've been a terrifically attentive group. Thank you very much for your attention. No, I'll do it. I don't know how much time is left, and someone, I can feel the hook pulling me off the. Okay, great. I'm happy to do questions, and why don't you just raise your hand and I'll call on you and ask the question, or give the observation. Yes, ma'am.
Deborah Tannen, I'm on the faculty at Georgetown. Hi, I'm Deborah Tannen, I'm on the faculty at Georgetown.
I'm very honored to meet you.
Honored to meet you and to listen to you. It was such a deeply moving talk, and I think all of us are feeling, at least Mary Sue, as our daughter. How large a role does the absence and weakness of unions play in this? And just a real quick word about my own thought about that. I'm very much a product of the equal opportunity of the earlier generation. I'm on the faculty at Georgetown. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. I was born in New York City, so there was public education there. My father did go to law school at night, became a lawyer. Unfortunately, it was the Depression when he passed the bar, and eventually did start practicing law when I was in junior high. But until that, he was a worker in the garment district.
Right.
The reason his salary supported us at a middle-class level was unions.
Right.
It was his getting a union job that made the difference, and he talked about that. The non-union workers doing the same work could be made to work 6 days a week, however many hours
Right.
the boss wanted, at whatever pay he felt like paying. If you're a member of the union, you got paid overtime for evenings and weekends, which is what he did.
Right.
It seems that now, well, and obviously a big part of Mary Sue's misfortune was the close of the factories.
Right.
Those factories jobs weren't there. But could there be a difference made in our society today without the manufacturing jobs if unions were strong? It seems that people at every level, including the working class, have lost faith in unions.
Right.
And you hear very little positive about unions.
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question. And indeed in the op-ed that I published in the New York Times last summer, I specifically mentioned that the jobs at these factories were all UAW jobs. And I got some flack, actually, in the comments afterwards for claiming that I wanted to bring back unions. Well, I'm not whether they call that flack or not is a different matter. But people noticed that I attributed the fact that there was this upward mobility in my generation. I'm a lot older than you are, but that's that same generation in which the dads who were working class had a decent living. And so if you ask me personally to vote, I'd vote for more strength for unions. But I'm conscious, I think that we're going to solve this problem. We're going to solve the problem if we get contributions, ideas and political contributions. I don't mean money, I mean contributed political power from large numbers of people. So I think unions did, for sure, they did contribute to the upward mobility of that previous period. And I personally would like it if they continued. But the most important thing is to get good paying jobs somehow to those working class guys. We need to strike a bargain with working class guys in America. That is less educated guys. We're, as a society, going to do something for you because you've been left behind by the economy of the last 30 years. You have got to do something too. You've got to start paying more attention to your progeny. because that's an obligation too. I don't mean this as a quid pro quo, of course. We ought to be helping these poor guys anyhow, and they ought to be taking care of their kids anyhow. But if the unions are the right way to do what you say, I mean, I'm aware of the public opinion about unions. In fact, I know quite a bit about the public opinion about unions, and I'm not hopeful that long downturn in unionization can be reversed, even though I would like it. But I think we've got to solve this problem. When I say this problem, we've got to solve the problem of the collapse of working class economic prospects one way or another. Unions or, an earned income tax credit or more public stimulus or more enterprise zones. I mean, I'm kind of agnostic, actually, about how we do that, but we ought to do that. We ought to do it for its own sake, and we ought to do it because otherwise we're going to have just more and more Mary Sues. Yes, sir.
Ambassador Diaz, and I speak as a Catholic theologian now, and not as Ambassador Diaz, and I speak as a Catholic theologian and not as the former ambassador. I'll just give my personal story here. I am the first to be educated in my family to reach a college education. My wife also has a doctorate, so both doctorates, both professors. If it wasn't because one set of grandparents has a little bit of extra income to help us, we would not be able to afford a college education for our own kids. A child who has a perfect 800 on the SAT.
Right. Wow, congratulations.
Education has become impossible. I mean, and of course they're smart, so they want to apply to the best colleges to get the opportunities that all the other kids have, right? Well, they get accepted into these colleges. The tuition rate there is $60,000. How much does the college professor make in the United States? I rest my case.
I agree with much of what you say, but I actually, in order to be provocative, want to disagree a little bit. Not disagree with what you say, but put it in a different perspective. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if this is what a college professor, I mean, imagine the poor that you're describing.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying, that their chances,
Yeah.
which, by the way, I also think there are cultural and racial factors involved,
Yeah, sure.
are much, much less because they haven't had the kind of things that you describe. I mean, it's an obligation for us as a family to eat together as a family at least, several times a week,
Sure.
4 or 5 times,
Sure.
because we know the benefits of that.
Sure.
But that's what I'm saying. I mean, a kid comes home and, oh, Mom, Dad, there's an immersion program for marine biology in the Bahamas. How much does it cost?
Sure.
$4,000.
Right. So I want to try to choose my words carefully here. But I will give the unqualified version first, and then I'll add the qualifications. Academics usually do it the other way around. We list all the qualifications, and then we say what we're trying to say. Schools are to blame for schools at any level are to blame for almost none of this problem. Schools are the site within which you see this problem. But on net, nationwide, the effect of schools, K to 16, is to slightly narrow the gap between the scissors. That's even true of K-12. They don't close it, and that's worth noting because historically, the purpose of schools in America was to narrow the gap. The purpose of schools was to make sure that everybody, no matter what their family background, were able to do well in life. Go back to the founding of the American public school system or for that matter, the parochial school system in the early 19th century. The purpose was to allow kids to get ahead, even though they didn't have a whole lot of, family background behind them. I mean, family economic background behind them. So we can complain about the schools not doing enough to close the gap, but there is a tendency in America to blame everything on schools, or now on universities, and then assume that the responsibility is for them to fix it. And when I say almost, let me see if I can be a little more precise. The gaps are fully formed at age 5, before kids enter school. Much more important than anything that happens in school in terms of widening the gap. There are a few things that widen the gap. Tracking tends to widen the gap a little bit, but that's that's not a big deal because tracking is on its way out. Look across the course of the year, test scores across the course of the year are really interesting. During the school year, the test scores get narrower and narrower. In the summer, the test scores gap grows as working class kids are out of the school system and they're left on their own. So I'm going to come back to your question, but I want the background thing that I want to say is we shouldn't think this is a school system, and for that matter, we shouldn't think it's a college system. College finances need to be re-examined. Probably we all agree about that. And we need to think carefully about that challenge. But even in the, but it's not, it may be good or bad for other reasons, but it's not the main source of the thing I'm talking about here. And indeed, if you look at school finance and student loans and all that sort of stuff, if I could correct one thing, it wouldn't be to force Jack to lower his tuition here or to force him to raise fellowship aid or something. I'd like you to do that, please. But that's not the problem is these poor kids lack savvy about how to interact with the post-secondary school world. And that means they are sitting ducks for a bunch of allegedly post-secondary institutions that are mostly for-profit institutions. For-profit are by far the most rapidly growing form of post-secondary education. We'd like to think that, okay, they're going to be helping out these kids who would, who are going to be the plumbers of the next generation or whatever. But the research, this may be a different talk, but the research that's coming out now makes clear that those organizations take huge amounts of loans. They basically exist, I'm going to probably be sued for this, but kind of as a kind of bait and switch operation. They get kids to come in, they get the federal government to pay for the loans. The kids default on the loans because what they get in the school doesn't enable them to pay their loans back. And that's mostly where the student debt is coming from. The student debt is mostly not coming from Georgetown or Harvard undergraduates. Indeed, you could come to Harvard, and you probably have some similar statistics. You could come to Harvard if your family income is, what is it now, $125,000? If your family income is $125,000 or less, we will pay you to come to Harvard if you can get in. But the problem is that all those things that happened in the first 5 to 10 years of life make it very hard for kids to even come into the scene here. So I'm not opposed to doing more to fund worthy kids from poor backgrounds to get into Georgetown or Harvard or I'm sorry, I've now forgotten where you're about to go off to.
Well, actually, one is at Carleton and the other one's about to go to.
No, where you're about to go to a.
Loyola.
Loyola. I'm sorry. Why did I forget Loyola? So I'm not saying we shouldn't worry about how to enable kids to get in Loyola, but in terms of the list of things, the to-do list, it's top of the president's agenda or near the top of the president's agenda. But I think that's kind of a mistake. I think there are other things that we could do that would have a much bigger effect on college completion rates by poor kids. Ping, pong, ping, pong, ping, pong. You see what I'm trying to say? You go back to all that missing. So, I will say one more thing about education. There is some educational reform we can do that would have a big impact, and that is universal early childhood education. That would be a really big deal. It's especially if it's wraparound. Now, I'm sorry, maybe I'm talking jargon here. You could do early childhood education that is in effect kind of glorified daycare, or you could do, as the original Head Start program was, early childhood education that was serious and that included the parents in the discussion, and that really works. It's really expensive, but in the big picture, it's not expensive. So it's a hugely positive investment. The Nobel Prize-winning economist James Heckman has shown it's a better investment than anything you can get in the marketplace. It has a huge rate of return, but it requires us to pay for other people's kids. And at previous times in American history, we've introduced major educational reforms the clearest example of this is the introduction of the high school. Do you all know that the high school was invented in America around 1900 in Nebraska or Iowa or someplace like that? That is, we had post-primary education, but the idea that everybody should be there should be a free, publicly provided education up through 12 grades was not an obvious thing to do. It now seems so obvious that we can't imagine. It seems like, of course you have high schools. But we didn't have high schools, public high schools, until about 1910. And it was introduced in the Midwest and then spread pretty quickly across the country. It was by far the best investment that anybody made in the 20th century, period. It was a terrific investment because it did two things simultaneously. It raised social mobility, because it allowed a lot of kids from poor backgrounds to nevertheless get a high school degree. And it raised the net productivity of the American economy so much that economists now looking back at all of the economic growth in America in the 20th century, most of it was the result of that investment in high school education. So it was a big win-win. It raised our productivity and it also raised mobility for kids. But at the outset, there was this problem. Why should I pay for somebody else's kids to go to high school? I mean, I'm sitting there in this little Iowa village. I'm not very rich. And now the people in town want me to tax me. My kids are off, doing something else. They're now living in Chicago or whatever. I'm supposed to be taxed to pay for somebody else's kids? But what was unique about these towns is people willingly imposed taxes on themselves for other people's kids. Do you see how that's related to the Pope's line about ignoring other people's kids? And so this is the way I look at the proposals for having early child education, and people who say, no, that'd be wonderful, we could do that, but it's just way too expensive. And I'm trying to say, wait a minute. It's certainly going to be, we know all of the evidence is going to be a big payback. And secondly, it isn't expensive if you think that those are your kids too. Is that making sense? Yes, back here.
I wanted to ask you if we had these pre-K programs, do you think it would help us to get back to the common good if some families were still paying for their kids to go to the private pre-K, much more developed curriculum program? Would we be in the same situation if the class stratification of the educational sites continued?
Well, it depends a whole lot. I mean, look, I would like it if all kids went to were in the same schools, only because I think that sharing the common experience would be good for them. They would know more about other kids in other social classes. And that breaking down of what I call bridging social capital, the fact that none of us know anybody from a different class, I think would be a good thing. And by the way, when you got to high school, maybe some of the rich girls would decide to marry some of the poor guys and vice versa. So it would help to reweave the fabric of the society. On the other hand, I don't want to take on the question of whether people should be forbidden for spending money on their schools. And in fact, Rosemary and I helped Miriam spend 2 years in a private school. She was having trouble in the Pittsburgh public schools. We helped her, and it was great for her. And so if I were to say I don't think parents or grandparents should be allowed to help them, I'd be a total hypocrite. And I don't even feel bad. It's not like I feel like I'm confessing something. Miriam's life is going to be better off, and nobody else's life is going to be worse off because we helped with that. But really, somebody should be asking me to pay for Mary Sue. I mean this quite seriously. Should be asking me to pay for Mary Sue, or at least the local Mary Sue's in Cambridge and New Hampshire where we live. I'm not. It's a big ask to get people to stop paying for their own kids' education, and maybe not even a good thing to do. So you hear me ducking on the question. Let's first of all make sure that we're paying for other people's kids to get a high-quality wraparound, not glorified daycare, but a high-quality wraparound pre-care experience. If they could do it at Oklahoma, which is the reddest of the red states in America, we ought to be able to do it here. Let's go over there. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Hi, yes. I wanted to ask you, do you think that the end of the draft had an effect on this disparity between people who don't know anybody else who's from a different class? I mean, the draft, whatever you think of the various wars, nonetheless, was a great leveler in society. It introduced people to people they would never have otherwise met.
Yeah. Yes. Rosemary says I sometimes answer questions too long. Yes, and it would be good if we had a much more elaborate national service program today. Not necessarily military, but national service program today. I'm told that that was the last question. On the other hand, I answered it really quickly, so maybe we can squeeze one more in. Yes, I can't I'm sorry, I really can't see. I can see a hand right here. I'll answer both questions. Go ahead. You first.
My name is Charles Steele Jr. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh,
Yes, sir. And I'm president, CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King organization. And Dr. King advocated for poor people. And I would like to ask you the question. First, I want to make a statement, then ask you a question. From my traveling around the world and representing the spirit of Dr. King, I discovered that most poor people don't have the opportunity to travel and be exposed. And I think that's 50% of the problem. They don't know anything other than where they live. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I'm a strong advocate of the poor in the spirit of Dr. King, but I'm also strong on collaboration and partnership. I would like to partnership with organizations and universities universally, worldwide, in terms of the spirit of Dr. King in advocating for poor people. In your experience, in your conceptual knowledge as a professor and a worldwide traveler yourself, what would you suggest to me as president and CEO of Dr. King's organization in order to collaborate and to bring about partnerships?
First of all, I'm grateful for your question. Secondly, I'm intimidated by the question because you know way more about your organization and your city than I do. So I hesitate to impose my own ideas. As it happens, however, Atlanta is one of the places where we have done field work. So actually I know the lives of some poor kids and some rich kids in Alabama, indeed, in Atlanta. Indeed, the rest of you may not know this, but I'm sure you do know this. Atlanta is an amazing place. The Atlanta black community is an amazing place because it is there are more black college graduates in Atlanta, relatively speaking, than in any other major metropolitan area, and also more black poor people in Atlanta. The black community in Atlanta there are lots of really rich, I don't mean really, really rich, but there are said to be more black millionaires in Atlanta than any place else. So there's a big black upper middle class, and there's a terribly desperate black underclass in Atlanta. And we've interviewed kids from all those backgrounds. So I don't mean we know what it's like to live there, but we've certainly experienced through the eyes of these kids. And Atlanta's a lovely place, but Atlanta has in concentrated form all the problems that I've talked about today, probably more than any other metropolitan area in America. It ought to be, and some of this has come out by other people's studies, it's also true in our studies, Atlanta is a challenged city. Atlanta has deep faith resources in the black community, of course, but also in the white community. And if I were you, I would want to say to my fellow religious leaders in Atlanta, let's look ourselves in the eye. All of us have got a big problem with class differences within the black community, within the white community, and within the incipient Latino community. None of us are without sin here, so none of us can start throwing the stones here. We collectively have got to do something. We're the repository of moral authority in Atlanta. I apologize for sounding like I'm lecturing at you, because I just have enormous respect for the work that I know you're already doing. But I really think if Atlanta could fix this problem, it would be a light for the nation, because the problem is so serious there. Forgive me for lecturing at you, sir. I honestly didn't mean to make it sound like I was lecturing at you, but you did invite me to. I think you're telling me we should. We just do one last question from a Georgetown student. Oh, sure, of course we can. How can I say no to that?
That's right. Hi, I'm Malik Jow from Georgetown. I'm a sophomore this year.
Hi.
And I was just wanted to say, as a young black male, despite the great opportunities and social and educational opportunities I've been given, I still feel targeted sometimes. And I was just wondering, what role do you think our elders should play in terms of regarding this problem?
There are several different aspects to the answer to that question. Young black males are targeted physically in this country, and all of us should think of young black males as our kids who are being singled out unfairly and in a prejudiced way. And we all know of particular cases that are in your mind and my mind right now, of completely innocent black kids who've been mistreated, killed even, because they were targeted. And that's a shame on our country. And it illustrates what I tried to say earlier on, that although I'm very concerned about this class issue, I didn't mean for a second to say there wasn't residual racism, and that's the residual racism you talked about. You just called me out on that, and I agree with that. There's a different sense in which black young males might feel targeted, and that's not the physical targeting that you might get shot or killed, but the sort of sociological targeting that you're held to blame for the problems. And I don't want to do that, but I do want to say that young men who have not had very much education, of whatever race they are, this is completely an equal opportunity phenomenon across. It's true among Latinos, and it's true for sure among whites, and it's true basically in every part of America. Young, less educated guys are not being responsible with respect to the results of their procreation. And we all have to, it's not just a matter of lecturing at them. And I'm certainly not lecturing at you. I don't believe that about you for a second. Partly because, frankly, you're educated, and educated young men of all races are not behaving this way. But we have to all think about how we can address that problem. I don't have an easy answer. But that's more of the red part of the problem, right? That's the problem that we ought to be able to understand more through red lenses. My habitual lenses are blue lenses. Your lenses are red lenses, so I'll leave that problem to you. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you all for your participation in our conversation this evening, and I'd like to express our gratitude to Professor Putnam for his moving, inspiring, and challenging reflections here this afternoon, and for his continued work to more deeply understand the underlying dynamics that we all need to respond to. I wish again to thank the Kennedy Center, the Archdiocese of Washington, the Pontifical Council for Culture for enabling us all to be together this afternoon. I know that many of us will be continuing our time together this evening. In our conversations in planning this event, Cardinal Ravasi thought it very important that we try to, in this first courtyard of the Gentiles in the United States, try to engage youth and reach youth culture. So we're now going to move to a special concert, Faith, Hip Hop, and the Common Good, which brings together a selection of artists from around the world who promote peace and social change. And we're going to begin this concert in the Eisenhower Theater directly following this event. You should have received your ticket at our check-in table this evening. We'll conclude our evening after the concert with a dinner reception right outside this room in the atriums in the foyer, where we'll have a chance to continue our conversations of the day. Tomorrow we'll convene for our conference at Georgetown, which will include academic panels and conversations and interfaith celebration at Holy Trinity Church, and then a dramatic performance of Flannery O'Connor's classic short story, Everything That Rises Must Converge. On Friday, on the final day of the conference, we'll gather at the Library of Congress for panel discussions on the perspectives and contributions of policymakers and the media in advancing the common good. I again wish to express, on behalf of all of us, our deep appreciation to you all for your presence here this afternoon. I look forward to our time together over the next few days. Thank you very much.